The Evolution of Data Science in Soccer, a conversation with Patrick McCreanor, brought to you by Human Data Intelligence and Soccerex.
Hello everyone, and welcome again to another episode of our Human Data Intelligence podcast. Hi Alan, I'm Mark, and most of all, hi Patrick. Thank you so much for joining. For those of you that are not familiar with Patrick McCreanor is the CEO of Soccerex, by far the best soccer conference out there. You guys have an upcoming date in Miami, actually, which I'm going to attend. It's my first Soccerex. I'm very excited. Patrick, thank you so much for joining us.
Appreciate it. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Patrick, before starting talking about data science, I would like to give you the chance to talk a little bit about Soccerex, because what you guys are doing is really important in the industry. And I did my research. I was really impressed by the lineup of speakers you guys have. But a lot of people might not know about Soccerex, so I want to give you the chance to give a little bit of an introduction. So they get to learn more about what you guys are doing and are up to.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Soccerex is a now 28-year-old business that was started in 1996 by Duncan Reevy and his wife Rita. Duncan being the son of legendary England and Leeds United manager Don Reevy, so a family name kind of steeped in soccer history. And the idea was to create an event or a business that connected the global football industry or soccer industry, bring people together from all around the world to provide thought leadership, best practice examples, and fundamentally do business, and create an environment where it was open to discuss, the future of the game, technology, innovation. But the core of the business is really about connecting the game and the key stakeholders within it to organizations that want to work with them and vice versa. And as you mentioned, Miami in November, and that will be our 53rd event in 22 cities. So a pretty incredible timeline. And you touched on people that have spoken at our events, and they range from the late great Maradona to Ronaldinho to Ronaldo and all of the greats that you would expect. So yeah, we're looking forward to Miami, which is kind of become our staple event and our biggest event of the year, in a great time for the game in the US and in particular on the East Coast.
I appreciate you guys chose Miami because it's right down the road from where I live. So thank you, Patrick, for that. But Patrick, like you touched upon a few points that to me are extremely interesting, because when soccer or football started, it was all about winning the game, having good players, having good coaches. But as sports develop, we are seeing that winning the game goes down to that 1% that you do better than the other team. And usually having good players doesn't let you win the team. And starting with Moneyball, which really was like the big hype about data science, really Billy Bean started a whole movement that is going into many directions, from a biomedical to the psychological to the athletic one. And you are at the forefront. Every year when you do an event, you see this technology passing by your hands. And I was curious to see what kind of evolution are you seeing, like when looking at this technology, and how complex the sport has become?
I think it might be one of the quickest evolutions you've seen. The explosion in data science and the use of technology has seen significant increase over the last few years. Whether you look at data analytics or a better understanding of human physiology, it's had an incredible impact over the last few years. And kind of fusing those things and looking at a real shift into, you touched on it, kind of Moneyball or an evidence-based approach to optimize the performance and also reduce injury risk is something we've seen increase an incredible amount, and actually across the entire globe. It was previously where the top sides or the biggest clubs in the world would have a certain approach, and other teams might be a few years behind. I think there's been a global adoption of technology in football right the way down to grassroots. I mean, even my 13-year-old nephew runs around with an a wearable vest, a GPS tracker on his chest at 13. So it's literally from top to bottom, and the impact of technology on the game is evident whether you're a consumer or somebody involved in the sport.
But Patrick, just a question before I ask Alan and Mark something. I've been working with data for a long time, and there is a big problem when technologies develop as fast. And the problem is, how do you differentiate from useless technologies to good technologies, right? It must be hard for a team. Do teams communicate when they find something that works, or do they keep it a secret? Like, how does this evolve? Because there is a lot of things that really don't do anything for teams that they're still out there, though.
Yeah, always, right? I think I'd probably use this as an opportunity to kind of promote Soccerex, and so it's one of the reasons that we exist, so that people within the game can share knowledge and expertise, and ways to win, ways to improve that 1%, the small details thing that you touched on earlier on as well. So I think in some cases, yes, some clubs are better at sharing information than others, and I guess that in a game that does come down to winning, people with a winning formula will always say that theirs is the best, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I feel like, Alan, I would like to start with you here. You, together with Mark, you guys have worked with a lot of business executives in your career, right? And, in business, it's funny to say we've used data for a lot longer than we have in sports. If you were to say the biggest, maybe 3 advantages of using data-driven decision as opposed to emotional decisions, so to say, what would you say are the 3?
Wow, and you asked me to identify 3. I'll see what I can do about that. I'll talk more broadly first, and then see if I can't zero in. And before I do though, I want to go back to something that Patrick said. One of the evolutions that's taken place with data and the data science is that in the past, companies, organizations would compete on their knowledge stock, that information they had, and they would protect it very carefully. It's Coke's secret recipe, Kentucky Fried Chicken's, 11 herbs and spices or whatever. And that was stock, and that was information they had that nobody else had. But with the explosion of data science, what companies have understood or begun to understood, and I think Patrick's just explained that in the soccer world, is that you don't compete on the stock of knowledge you have. You compete in your ability to use the flow of knowledge that exists. There's so much information out there that if you don't tap into that, then you're at a competitive disadvantage. But one of the requirements, and I have a brother who works in the Unix universe, one of the requirements of participating in that knowledge flow is that you have to share your own knowledge as well. Now, obviously there's some things that organizations won't share, shouldn't share, but there's an awful lot that they do share. And I think we see that reflected in the large amounts of data that are made available publicly that companies in the past would never share. And so I just want to make that point, because it's the participation in the knowledge flow. Companies, organizations, teams have to be a part of that, or they'll lose ground in the competition. So back to what are the critical things, and I'll see if I can remember your question. I think the first thing that organizations have to do is to recognize and make a distinction between what I'll call superstitious learning, and I'll use the term that Patrick mentioned, which is evidence-based learning. And the superstitious learning is you do certain things and then you experience success, and you have a tendency to link those things you did with the success, but not everything you did was related to that success. They just happened to be things you did. A number of years back, I was working with a number of Japanese agencies institutions, the Japan Federation of Employers, for example, and this was back in the 80s and into the 90s, they were trying to figure out what aspects of Japanese management were things that could be exported and applied elsewhere in the world, and what were things that were just unique to Japanese culture and Japanese way of doing things. And it was a really fascinating study to be a part of, because they went through and very carefully tried to study, do we need to all wear company uniforms? Do we all need to sing the company song? Do we all need to do afternoon calisthenics? You know, it was a lengthy list. There must have been 75 or 100 different things there. But what they were doing was trying to separate I'll say the myth of things that made Japanese companies successful, the superstitious learning that others were observing. Oh, we need to have a company song. No, you don't need a company song.
Yeah, I don't think Americans
would need to have agreement on how we view the world, sort of thing. And so I think that's the first part. And what data science has done is really pushed companies to focus much more on what's the evidence and step away from that superstitious learning. Having said that, the tendency towards superstitious learning is that you then start to focus on metrics that may not be as influential as you thought they were, in part because you like them. And so this is an ongoing process of, we pay attention to certain metrics until we come to understand that was just a byproduct of something else that was more important. I would say that's the first aspect. The second thing I think that companies have to be aware of, the organizations and individuals in that regard, is to figure out where the baseline is as they're looking at trying to improve and do better. And when I talk about where the baseline is, we typically think of the baseline as this is where you're started, and that's where you're starting from, and that's true to some extent. But there's also a baseline, a different baseline, which is what is the norm? And so some organizations start from a baseline that's very low, and yes, that's where we have to go up from. But there's also what is, if we want to call it the industry standard, if we want to call it the industry benchmark, what's the industry benchmark? So some organizations are starting from below the baseline. And while it's great to see improvement, they're not advancing so much as they're just trying to catch up. And I think that's a really important distinction, because in this day and age, it's possible to leapfrog, to make significant advances, particularly if you can identify those areas, those, I'll call them levers, that will boost you significantly. I'm thinking, switch technologies here. Hong Kong made this extraordinary boost in the 1990s. It was very difficult to install landline telephone lines in Hong Kong. You have apartment buildings that are very tall and quite complex, and getting all of that, installed was very difficult. And then cell phone technology came along, and Hong Kong essentially said, we don't need landlines. We're just going to skip. I think organizations do the same thing. Instead of saying, we have to go through this process that we saw in soccer, in this case, that other teams worked through, we don't have to do that. We can leapfrog that if we can identify the right metrics, the right tools to do. So I think I'm going to leave it at 2.
No, that's perfect. And I have a question for Mark, but first I want to ask Patrick something which connects to Mark's question, which is, when we go to business school, and they always teach us about early technology adopters and the majority of the people which are resistant to change. So what happens is that there is such a great technology. If you adopt it, you're going to get the first mover advantage. Systematically, 95% of people do not adopt it, but they chase after the technology once the few early movers move in. Patrick, have you seen a lot of resistance to change in the industry when it comes to adopting new technologies in data science?
No, I don't think so. I think, if anything, it's the opposite. I think Alan touched on a point earlier on about competitive advantage, and I think people in any sport, and football is no different. They're constantly seeking that competitive advantage, and I think that when you're looking at technology and how quickly it's evolving, whether it's wearable tech we touched on, whether it's AI from a commercial perspective, clubs are constantly looking at how they can embrace new technologies. That the kind of differentiator is based on finance. The bigger the club, the bigger the budget, the more they can invest in new technologies and maybe take a risk or two. Whereas if you're maybe lower down the pyramid, you don't have as much money available, therefore can't take any even calculated risk as far as technology is concerned. So you might wait a little longer to see what's been successful for others and kind of onto a sure thing. I think overall, industry-wise, everybody's pretty open to new ideas now, unless it's VAR related. Then you might get some resistance, right?
We are not the first person we hear it from. It's funny. People don't like VAR. No, and the reason why I was asking you that question, Patrick, is because Mark, I know you specialize a lot into cognitive behaviors and trainings. Now, technology advancing so fast, it means that also the mind of people needs to advance so fast. Why do I say that? You need to be open to be adopting these technologies, taking those risks. So when it comes to choosing the leaders for your organization, you need to find the leaders that know how to balance this growth in opportunities, as well as the need to take in risks and making sure that you're always at the forefront of technology in this case. Do you think, like, over the years, the speed of technology growth needs to be matched by the speed at which the brain needs to work?
Is that for Patrick or?
That's for you, Mark.
Oh, okay. A short answer is yes. And it goes a little bit back to what Alan was saying. And actually, I'd like to learn some, Patrick, your perspective on this. Organizations, teams, when there is technology that can measure many, many different things, we tend to measure many, many different things, right? And the challenge is knowing which things we should measure and which things are not all that important to team success, organizational success. Let me give you something, not you, but something very, very quickly. A while back, probably one of the most brilliant minds on organizations, Kenichi Omai, realized that there's really only about 3 or 4 things in any industry that really make the difference in terms of success. And that excellent, managers, leaders, CEOs, whoever is in charge of a team, a fairly large team, the ones that were successful seem to intuitively know what they should measure, what they should focus on, and what other things they also could measure, but are less critical to the overall success. And it turns out that each industry had different areas that were critical, and the organizations that did less well tended to measure things that were not as critical to success in the industry. And the organizations that were successful somehow the people just were aware of what they should be focusing on, what they should be investing most of their time on. So to answer your question, Rocco, I think one, almost danger with data science, and I'm just going to call it the ability to measure a multitude of things, right? Like vests on, we can measure so much. The challenge is the wisdom on what to measure and what to focus on the most. In your experience with the adoption of all these new, data science in soccer, as you hear people talking, what are some of their complaints about it, or what are some of their concerns in the fact that, hey, we measured all this stuff and we're still not doing that well? I think, Rocco, what you brought up is there has to be wisdom, is the integration, right, of what to measure, and an understanding of what maybe we could measure it, but let's not worry about that so much, because those kind of measurements are ancillary to what actually is important. So I'm just kind of throwing that out as a general question to you, Patrick. What kinds of frustrations have you been observing with people as they try to grasp and deal with all these measurements that they're looking at?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think time is something that most people aren't afforded, especially in football, right? When it's a results-driven business and there's so much at stake, whether on the pitch or off it, commercially, and the success attached to it. So this is where you have a difference in the way that individual clubs are run. How long does a club give a department or a head of a department or whatever to implement something? How long do they measure that process? What do they look at? How many different things are they looking at? And I think it goes back to individuals. I think we touched on that a moment ago, the human side of it. And I think there's a direct correlation between the rise and increase in data science and data usage in football to the success of the executives behind the technology, or the ones using the technology. If you look at the last few years, whether it was Fenway Sports running Liverpool or Chelsea or whoever, they implement a system and a program and then bring people in to implement it, or the other way around sometimes. And if you look at the last couple of years in the UK in particular, the real executives that have had incredible success using these kind of methods are suddenly very, very valuable commodities.
Yes.
You've looked at Dan Ashworth with a £20 million clause to get him out of his contract at Newcastle to go to Manchester United. Richard Hughes going from Bournemouth to Liverpool based on the success that he's had at Bournemouth with the kind of Moneyball or metrics method. So I think a lot of it will come down to individuals. How good are those individuals? How good are the teams that those individuals can build? How experienced are they? How much of it is going to fall into a kind of trial and error with a new group maybe that might not have the experience of an Ashworth or a Hughes or an Edwards at FSG, for example. So I think I'm a big people person behind adopting the technology and how it's used. So I think that's definitely a big factor, and one of the reasons why executives have become such commodities or assets within football. A lot of it's still going to be trial and error, and there's going to be, football's a game of opinions, right? And that's off the pitch and off it. So if it's in the boardroom, you might get a team of people that disagree on 10 different things, and then you might get that leader that's got a proven methods that he or she brings in to implement at a club. So I think being fluid and flexible with the data and with the data science behind it, but having the right people in charge of those processes, I think is hugely important.
It is interesting what you say, Patrick, because we talk a lot these days about AI, data, all of this scientific stuff, but at the end of the day, we all go back to the human component. Mm-hmm. And when you go back to the human component, there is something that there is a keyword that we use, which is company culture. Because you talk about the board not getting along and all of these things happening, And it goes back to the basic. If you don't have the right culture, right? And before asking this question, I just wanted to bring up this comment from Kash, where he says you can measure data and extrapolate it, but who holds the responsibility to utilize it and actually bring about change, especially when the coach skill set is being measured as well? It's an interesting comment, right? Because if you think about that, data is there, but we don't need to forget football as fans. Fans have expectations. And sometimes, I know people don't like in this sport to say that, but fans are the toughest customers, because they are actually so involved with the company, which is the team that is football teams and sport teams in general are the companies with the highest, the most involved customers. And there is nothing you cannot forget there. But going back to the cultural aspect of things, Mark, Alan, Patrick as well, whoever wants to intervene, it sounds like to be successful with data, you need to have good leaders. And those good leaders are the ones that need to be open to change and adopting those ideas. Because otherwise, as Patrick said, you have great data, but if you don't get along on the top, this data really leads to nothing if you're not willing to actually make decisions based on that. I don't know, maybe Mark, if you want to start, like how important it is to have a culture that is ready for data.
I can jump in really quickly. A company's culture really is driven from, most of the time, especially in sports teams, from the top down. The owner. We've all seen it. We could talk about cases, especially in the Premier League, right? Where, I mean, Chelsea, Pochettino, and we could just go on and on and on, right? Where cultures are fluid, and a team can have a culture for a long time. New owner comes in, they're trying to figure things out. You've got managers who have their, like you mentioned, Patrick, their own style, what they want. And until there is a meeting of the minds, kind of an agreement on what we want, what we're doing here, then all the data science is all over the place, because as Kush just mentioned, who extrapolates that? And data has to be evaluated by human beings in the end. We like to say that the data shows us what to do. The data can only show us what we maybe want it to do, or how it fits with what we're trying to do. In the end, this is a human endeavor. And
so Mark, basically going back to the question that Kash asked, right, where he was asking us who is the responsibility to use the data, that's actually a vertical effort. Everybody owes a little bit of responsibility on how to use the data, because if you hire a coach, and I'm putting the question up here for people to have it handy, if you hire a coach that is stubborn and doesn't want to use the data, well, we can think about the movie Moneyball, right? What was happening in the first game when the players that they wanted to play were not played, right? So it's all about a company effort. If that chain is broken, well, you have a problem, right?
Well, if different people in the chain have different views about the data itself, yeah, it is broken. It's dysfunctional, because some people don't care about the data. Some people interpret it one way. Other people maybe just want to throw some of the data out. Yeah. So data is used by humans, and, a team like Brighton Hove Albion, they know they seem to really know what they're about. We would call it a business model, right? Maybe fans wouldn't like to hear that. They're all on board. They know. Everybody seems, I'm not an expert on that club, but everything I've followed, Patrick, I don't know what you would say. They really do seem to be aligned at all levels in their company culture. So they're able to use data in ways that are beneficial to them rather than frustrating to them. I don't know. What's your sense, Patrick, on that?
Yeah, I mean, you probably couldn't give a better current example than Brian, I don't think. We've done a lot of work with the club the last couple of years. Paul Barber, their CEO, has spoken at our events, and hopefully he'll be in Miami again. And that's kind of shown in how the data is linked across the entire business. So from the top down, from Tony Bloom, the owner, through Paul, the CEO, they've got a really focused and linked approach to data, whether it was about building the stadium, generating the revenue from the fans, the catchment area, into the commercial deals that they did, into scouting, which has been the most incredible success. And like you say, you can't have that connectivity without the vision coming from the top down. And what they do very well is they employ their coaches based on the entire culture of the club. So a mistake that a lot of people can make is just quite simply hiring the wrong person. If you've got a huge team of people focused on data and you bring in a manager rather than a coach, then that's probably going to backfire. You want a coach that's going to get the best out of the data with the people on the training ground and on the playing field, right? But yeah, Brighton are an incredible example of how to maximize impact on the pitch and off it too.
And Alan, before we jump in, I have a question that Patrick McCreanor is asking. Patrick McCreanor.
That's actually my dad.
Oh, okay. I was like, that's a first. No, that makes sense. But it's actually a very, very good question, Alan, that I wanted to ask you specifically, and anybody else can intervene, which is about, let's think about the players who are the poor 23 souls going on the pitch after all of this data is analyzed, right? So he asks, what additional pressure do players get put under when presented with so much data? And then the second part, I think, is mostly for Patrick. Does this data get held back from the athletes, maybe, to not affect the player mental health? So this is a very good question for Alan, myself, and Mark, which will work a lot with player mental health. It's a very great question for Patrick because he knows if they're hiding the information. I don't think so, but we will find out soon. So Alan, go ahead.
Well, let me answer that question by first connecting it to what we've just been talking about. In the early 90s, I did some research in Japanese companies, and at the time we didn't call it big data, we called it IT and big IT adoptions. And a colleague and I found something very fascinating, which was in Japan, and I think this is actually more universal. At the time, there were two approaches to what you do with all this data you're getting. And one approach was to centralize it, to exercise tight control over all of the information. And I would say, about half the companies we looked at were doing that, so that key decision makers could make the relevant decisions, and we won't bother employees with this information. They don't need to know about it. And then the other approach was to just make data open to anybody in the company at any level. In one company we studied, with the exception of personnel data, any employee in the company could go and look at anything in the company. So if some employee in one area of the company, say on the factory floor, wanted to know how sales were doing in another region and with another product line, they could hop on and look at that. So one was centralization, the other was decentralization. And there's an interesting balance there, which I think goes right to the heart of the question that Patrick Sr. is asking, which is, what do we share? What don't we share? And I think that goes back to the critical decisions that are made. We've been talking about some information's not as important as other information. And we can reframe that to also say some information is more sensitive than other information, particularly when it comes to player stress and and player mental health. And I would make 2 points in that regard. Humans are not capable of managing a large number of items. If we think about, how can we remember phone numbers? Well, we know that we're reasonably good at remembering like up to 7 numbers, and after that it gets sketchy. And the same way is true, and we know from our work that in trying to develop people, we may identify a large number of different areas where people can work and need to improve. But at heart, we're really only best focusing on not more than 3 particular areas at a time. And so that becomes then a strategic decision. If I'm a coach and I've got a player and I've identified 6 key weaknesses, or 6 key areas where improvement is needed, I can't tell the player, okay, here's the list, work on all of these. I have to make decisions about which of those are most important, which of those will have the largest impact. And that requires, and I won't go into it here, but some more complex thinking. Which of those, for example, if they're developed, will allow the player to naturally improve in some of the other areas? If I can improve my foot speed, or my reaction time, then that's going to have a ripple effect. Whereas if I improve in this other area, well, that's going to be an improvement, but it's not going to have the same cascade that it would. So there are different ways to approach that, but that's the first one, is what are the important things? And it goes right back to what Mark was saying with regard to companies. What are the 2 or 3 for an individual player? What should they be working on? The second part of it is the psychological, and this really requires, and this will be a pitch for what we do at HDI, this requires an understanding of the psychological aspects of what players bring with them, both in the locker room and on the pitch. Kind of what's their orientation? How receptive are they to feedback? And how receptive are they to feedback from coaches as opposed to trainers? These are the sorts of things that are critical then to understand, because we understand that, hey, if a coach tells a player this, they're going to respond, but if the trainer tells the player the same thing, they're going to ignore it. Then that becomes part of how we work with that player and manage that player. So I don't know that that's fully responsive to the questions that were asked, but I think that moves us in the direction of paying attention to how do we use this data we have, and how do we use that to manage not just the physical capabilities of the player, but also the psychological capabilities of the player.
So just to jump on what Alan said very, very shortly, the answer to Patrick Sr.'s question, in my view, is it depends. And it depends on what each player can handle, right? What clubs don't do for the most part is assess the psychological or emotional competencies of their players. And so oftentimes coaches, managers take a one-size-fits-all thing approach to players. And, but some players can handle, their mental health can handle a lot of feedback. Other players, like Alan was suggesting, no, they, you might only need to just work on even one thing at a time. Let's just take one thing. But because a lot of times clubs don't have a really good sense of the cognitive, emotional, and cultural capacities of their players, they kind of misuse this data with them, because in the end, it's very individualized per player.
And Patrick, what would you comment on that and your dad's question?
I think it's kind of similar to what's just been mentioned, actually. I think there are 2 things I look at in terms of the tech side of the players now. I think if you look at this generation of players coming through, they've been around tech their entire lives, which certainly helps. When you talk to them about embracing technology, they're a little bit more open to that than maybe a player in his mid-30s might be, for example. So the benefit of having so much data available is the ability for clubs to put together bespoke and individual training programs for individual players, right? And that's always the best, I find, from an organizational perspective, whether it's in football or otherwise. You know, the best way to get the best out of individuals is to treat them as an individual. So it's great to see that sport is now adopting that using data science and analytics, because you can monitor how somebody runs, the potential impact on injury based on framework or whatever it might be, right? So it's so in depth. And I think that certainly from an academy side of things, because the players are embracing this technology when they're so young. We talked about my nephew earlier with wearable tech at 13. They're doing that at 7, 8, 9 years old now. So they're quite used to having their data analysed pretty early. And actually, the kids and the youngsters actually quite enjoy doing that. They want to look at how far they can run, how fast they can kick the ball, you know, their sprint speed, their recovery speed, their resting heart rate, all of those sort of things. Because I think the obsession with fitness in general amongst the younger generation now is having an impact on that. You're right, though, it's much more difficult to measure the impact of the mental health side of things in terms of the pressure in general, I think, not just around training or data. And that's where we get back to the individuals. How well does the coach know his players or her players? How well do they react to their players having problems? How empathetic are they to problems they might be having? So there is that human link to data, link back to human effect again, that I think, as we said, will always play a part. But I think in the main, players are really embracing technology now. And again, that quest to just get that little bit better and the competition and improve themselves that 1%, 2%.
Oh, it's all interesting, guys. And we're almost at the end of our time, by the way. Time flew today. But I just wanted to spend the last few minutes talking again about Soccerex, because we can potentially go on and on about this topic. And I wanted to clarify that Soccerex did not ask to be on the webinar. I reached out to Soccerex and Patrick. I spoke at over 25 conferences in the last 2 years, and I researched Soccerex pretty much in depth before contacting Patrick. And I can say it was one of the few conferences that I've seen, and that's why I'm going to go, where they actually bring value to the people attending. Most of these conferences, you pretty much pay to speak, you pay to have a banner, you pay to do everything. Here is one of the few conferences where I saw that you actually put the attendees first rather than your own pockets first. And that's why I think it's such a great conference, and I'm excited to come visit you guys. But Patrick, I want to give you a few minutes to say anything you want to say about the upcoming event, why people should attend, why people should not attend if you don't want them to attend, right? Feel free to share anything you want, and just make this introduction because I want people to know that you guys did not pay to be here. You just came to share your opinion, and I want them to know that everything they're going to hear from you is just something we are discussing right now.
Yeah, I appreciate all of those words, Rocco. I think we are very different. Yeah, we're number one in the world for what we do, and the reason for that is simple. We've kept a 28-year-old company ethos that was started by Duncan and mentioned on the company website still now, which is take care of the game, and the business takes care of itself. So at the heart of everything that we do is football or soccer. We're surrounded by soccer people. My team are full of them. It's a real kind of labor of love. And the idea is that we've adopted what was a fantastic business, kind of modernized it a little bit, slightly commercialized the approach in that, no, you're right, we don't sell seats on a panel, we don't sell underhand sponsorship. But what we do is we sell out of all of our sponsorship assets because we approach the market in the right way. People know that we can bring 2,000 to 2,500 people, 70+% of them are C-suite executives within the game, together in one place. And it's really difficult if you work in the world of football to speak to that many people over the course of a year, 2 years, 3 years, let alone 2 or 3 days in a wonderful city like Miami. So I think that's really what we do. We bring everybody together. We're not experts in any of the 30, 40, 50 topics that we talk about over the course of the 2 days, but we're experts at bringing those people together and facilitating business and relationships. And there's a reason some people have been coming to our events for 20 plus years. And, you know, I met a guy in Miami that has been coming to Soccerex events since I was at school, and I'm now the CEO. So, you know, I'm 45 now. So when you kind of paint that picture, it's pretty incredible the reach that this brand has. And, you know, it's an honor to be CEO of a business that I've been around for 15, 16 years in kind of different formats. And yeah, Miami will be crazy again. Last year, we broke 28-year-old company records for attendance and revenues and all of those things that was done completely organically without spending a dollar on marketing or anything like that. Just good old-fashioned hard work and some clever work from the team and support globally from, you know, a huge list of partners, from institutional partners to sponsors and exhibitors. So it's a privilege, and I think Miami will be another incredible event in a great city, great venue. Hard Rock Hotel and Casino will announce a couple of other things this week. The speakers will start getting announcing next week. Looking really exciting, from legends through to people running clubs and federations, as you would expect. So you guys obviously all completely welcome to come as my guests and experience it and enjoy Miami. But I'd say don't look forward to 3 or 4 nights of lots of sleep, because that doesn't happen. So it's eventful.
That's quite an introduction. I hope most of the listeners will come. I'm sure it will be a great event. And I'd like to take the time again to thank everybody that listened in. I really appreciate your time. I would like to thank Alan, Mark, and Patrick. You guys please stay connected so I can greet you offline. But thank you so much again for joining, and we are going to keep you posted on our next episodes. Bye-bye, everyone.